Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning back in this week for a special bonus episode of the Insidious Agenda podcast, just for spooky season 2022. As always, I'm your host Nick, and on this bonus episode, we're going to explore the story of John Sherbrooke, George Wynyard, and the apparition that appeared to them. Ensure you're subscribed to this podcast so you don't miss out on any of our exciting weekly episodes and bonus episodes for spooky season 2022. Now let's turn down our lights just a little bit and get ready to be enveloped by a truly haunting story. Now follow along to the sound of my voice and let's get into our episode. From the year 1785, two young and ambitious officers can be found on the British Army list for service with the 33rd Regiment of Foot, a regiment that was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Fork and was garrisoned at Sydney on the island of Cape Breton in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. Lying on the Eastern Seaboard, Cape Breton was an incredibly strategic point in warfare that occurred less than 30 years before our story. Without going into too much detail, and taking away from our story, Cape Breton, or then known as the Ile Royale, was once a French stronghold which housed the fortress of Louisbourg, and its two satellite garrisons, which were located in the modern-day towns of St. Peter's and Englishtown. The main purpose for the fortress of Louisbourg was that it offered protection to the French settlers in Quebec from the British, who could use the St. Lawrence River to attack them. Unfortunately for the settlement of Quebec, Louisbourg would be lost to the British in 1745. It was handed back over to the French in the 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, but captured again 10 years later by the forces of British General James Wolfe during the 7 Years' War. 1785 was a special year for the island of Cape Breton. The year before, the British Crown saw fit that Cape Breton should be established as a colony. This stemmed from the large socio-economic pressure from colonists in England and loyalists who, after losing the Revolutionary War in the States, were looking for new places to live. In 1785, Cape Breton was founded at Sydney Harbour on the 21st of February. The town of Sydney was founded at that moment and named after Thomas Townsend, the first Viscount of Sydney. It was watched over by Colonel Joseph de Barre, who was named the Lieutenant Governor. Coming full circle, this was why there existed a British presence on the island. The two aforementioned officers on the list were Captain John Sherbrooke and Lieutenant George Wynyard. John Sherbrooke was born in Oxton of Nottinghamshire on the 29th of April, 1764. He enlisted in the British Army as an ensign on the 7th of December, 1780. He initially served with the 4th Regiment of Foot before being transferred to the 85th, where he was promoted to captain on the 6th of March, 1783. Sherbrooke would go on to fight in the American Revolutionary War, but following a reduction in the army, he was transferred to the 33rd Regiment. Lieutenant George Wynyard enlisted as an ensign on the 23rd of November, 1775, almost 5 years after Sherbrooke, and he too fought in the American Revolutionary War. Wynyard suffered a serious injury on the 11th of September, 1777 in the Battle of Brandywine. Following the force reduction plan, he too found his way by transfer to the 33rd. Fortunately for Sherbrooke and Wynyard, they quickly became good friends. They were very congenial, both described as being pleasant people and having the same tastes and studies. They spent much of their time reading and educating themselves, unlike many of their fellow officers. It was a key attribute to military character at the time that education and knowledge were one of the chief accomplishments of an officer's career. This story begins on the 15th of October in 1785. At around 4 p.m., the pair of officers and their friends, Sir Hildebrand Oakes and Lieutenant Ralph Gore, had just finished their dinner for the evening. Sherbrooke and Wynyard declined the invite to take part in libations and returned to their apartment, where they would have a casual evening of reading, rest, and relaxation. Oakes and Gore retired upstairs, while Sherbrooke and Wynyard remained downstairs. According to author T.M. Jarvis, their accommodation was described as the following. The apartment in which they were had 2 doors in it, the one opening into a passage and the other leading into Wynyard's bedroom. There were no means of entering the sitting room but from the passage, and no other egress points from the bedroom but through the sitting room, so that any person passing through in the bedroom must have remained there unless he returned by the way that he entered. Sometime between 8 or 9 o'clock, Captain Sherbrooke, who was wrapped up in the book he was reading, glanced up at the door that opened into the passageway when he noticed someone standing there. It was a boy, youthful, who was tall and appeared about 20 years old. The boy looked extremely thin and sickly. Sherbrooke couldn't place the boy from among his ranks and was outrightly confused by his presence. He turned to Lieutenant Wynyard and got him to have a look for himself. His face turned ghostly white. Captain Sherbrooke would later state, "I have heard of a man being pale as death, but I never saw a living face assume the appearance of a corpse, except Wynyard's at that very moment." The 2 men stared at the person who had intruded on their evening in absolute silence. For Sherbrooke's part, he had no understanding of who this individual was. But for Wynyard, he seemed to know this person, but seemed at a complete loss for words. As they looked on, the figure began to move slowly into the adjoining apartment. Before he disappeared out of view, he cast a solemn gaze at Lieutenant Wynyard, and he was gone. Sherbrooke didn't immediately assume that this presence was some kind of ghost or ethereal entity. He grabbed his friend, a hold of his arm, and appeared to have finally caught his breath. His silence was broken, and words emanated from him in a low, almost inaudible tone. "Great God, my brother." Visibly still confused, Sherbrooke asked him, "Your brother? What do you mean?" "Wynyard, there must be some deception. Follow me." Sherbrooke grabbed a hold of his friend by the arm, and they moved into the next room, which was the bedroom. As stated before, this was connected to the sitting room and the direction of which their visitor had moved. There would have been no way for that person to have moved out of the apartment except by the way they would already have come, passing Sherbrooke and Wynyard in the process. Hearing the commotion from up above, they were joined by Oakes and Gore, who witnessed nothing on their way to their friend's side. When they entered the bedroom, the room was found uninhabited. There was no person there at all. But how could this be? The 2 officers were absolutely astonished. For Wynyard, he knew exactly who this was from the moment he laid eyes upon the boy, for this was his brother. Sherbrooke still refused to believe that this was his friend's brother and that it was some trick of pure delusion. Nonetheless, nothing would be solved that evening. At the recommendation of Gore, Sherbrooke made a quick note of the hour and date they had witnessed the interloper. Still, they didn't understand how any of this was possible and endeavored to keep this between themselves and not involve the chain of command or the remainder of the regiment. Sherbrooke truly believed this to be the handiwork of one of their fellow officers, although they couldn't formulate how they possibly could have pulled this off. It seemed almost too perfect. Unfortunately for Wynyard, The appearance of his brother brought on many consistent feelings of worry for his safety back home. He would anxiously await any mail to arrive from England to either assuage him of his fears or confirm them. He became so wrapped up in this, questioning his brother's health and discussing it with his fellow officers, thus that they were eventually able to coax out of him what the matter was. When he told them, the interest captured the attention of many of the regiment's officers. They all had a fascination with the appearance of Wynyard's brother, and they now as well eagerly awaited word to come from England. This was important for them as well, as they began to fear for the health and safety of their own friends and family members. They would keep Wynyard's secret amongst their group of officers. The first set of ships after the incident would arrive with no letter for the young lieutenant. This made sense, as they would have long been dispatched from England before the visit had taken place. Finally, the ship that they were awaiting would arrive on the 6th of June, a good many months after the encounter. Everyone in the officer corps received letters, with the exception of Wynyard. They eagerly read through many newspapers, but found no mention of any deaths. One letter had come for Sherbrooke as well, but remained unopened. The mail call came in the mess hall during supper hour. After leaving the hall, Sherbrooke broke the seal of the letter and began to read what was inside. He then requested the company of his friend, and the two departed the room. The entire mess hall went dead silent. All the other officers would wait eagerly for the return of Sherbrooke, for there was little doubt that this letter bore the answer to which they had waited so long. He returned to the company of his fellow officers after about an hour. Being gentlemen, none of them would dare inquire as to the nature of his private correspondence, so they waited for him to bring it up. Sherbrooke went to the fireplace, his mind racing with thoughts of pain and bewilderment. He leaned his head against the mantelpiece for a matter of moments before he broke the silence. In a low voice, he muttered the words, "Wynyard's brother is no more." The first line of the letter would go on to read, "Dear John, break to your friend Wynyard the death of his favorite brother." Sherbrooke knew, in reading this letter, that Wynyard's brother had died on that day in the very hour in which they were visited. It was not some cruel joke or bout of torment, but he and his friend had witnessed his brother's ghost come by their apartment to say one final farewell. Not much more is known about further circumstances after the reading of the letter, but one can only imagine the pure shock and disbelief in Sherbrooke and the overwhelming grief of Wynyard at the loss of his brother. By John Henry Ingram's account from 1884, the following was said about Sherbrooke. Some years after, on Sherbrooke's return to England, he was walking with two gentlemen in Piccadilly when on the opposite side of the way, he saw a person bearing the most striking resemblance to the figure which had been disclosed to Wynyard and himself. His companions were acquainted with the story, and he instantly directed their attention to the gentleman opposite as the individual who had contrived to enter and depart from Wynyard's apartment without their being conscious of means. Full of this impression, he immediately went over and at once addressed the gentleman he now fully expected to elucidate the mystery. He apologized for the interruption, but excused it by relating the occurrence which had induced him to the commission of this solecism in manners. The gentleman received him as a friend. He had never been out of the country, but he was another brother of the youth whose spirit had been seen. In the years that followed their encounter, Wynyard and Sherbrooke retold their story many times. Being described as men of great character and indisputable honor, it was never questioned and generally accepted that they saw the spirit of Wynyard's brother that evening. The two men would go on to lead very successful careers. Sherbrooke would continue to climb the ranks, fighting in the conflicts of the French Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, and even the War of 1812, achieving the rank of general. In 1811, he was appointed as the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, followed by an appointment as the Governor General of British North America 5 years later. He would work diligently, especially in fostering good relationships with the Francophones, until his death on the 14th of February in 1830. One of the people to examine the case and the two men in question was named Dr. Mayo. In his report, he would mention the following: I have had opportunities of inquiring of two near relations of this General Wynyard, upon what evidence the above story rests. They told me that they had each heard it from his own mouth. More recently, a gentleman whose accuracy of recollection exceeds that of most people told me that he had heard it from the late Sir John Sherbrooke, the other party in the ghost story, tell it in much the same way at the dinner table. A writer, named only as Cognatus, who gave an account of this incident in his book Notes and Queries from 1858, states that the brother who appeared to Lieutenant Wynyard was named John Ottaway Wynyard, or Jack for short. He was a lieutenant in the 3rd Regiment Foot Guards and died the same day as the encounter. In closing, shortly before Sherwood's death, it was told that he visited Gore's nephew. The nephew would go on to say the following about Sherbrooke: he was a very changed man, and had learned to look very seriously on subjects which concerned eternity. Some believe that this was because he expected to soon be called to another world, where all things would be revealed. He would still say, as in the presence of God, that every word he asserted was true, and that, although he could not tell for what purpose it was sent, he did see the figure, and it was exactly as he had described it. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it to the end of our special bonus episode about Sherbrooke and Wynyard's encounter with an apparition. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'd like to thank you very much for listening. For more information about our podcast and our socials, please visit the link tree in the show notes. And before you go, remember to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes to come. We'll be back on Tuesday for our regular episode where we will explore Salem and the history of witch trials. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious agenda. I'll see you again next week.